Hello again, welcome back. Here we are again working on React and working with Redux. In the previous video, we've been working on the previous couple videos, we've been working on the shopping cart and getting the shopping cart to work with Redux, right? So far we've got the shopping cart showing up, and if you click the add to cart button, it's not working, right? So let's take a look and figure out why that is, right? So, if I open up my console here, you can see that I don't have any errors, and when I click the button, nothing happens, right? Let's kind of follow through like what is happening with Redux, right? So what's happening here is when let's go all the way to the product component, right? Because what's happening here is we're clicking this button and we're dispatching an action, right? So like what happens when we do this, right? So if I open up my actions right here in the right pane, you can see that I've got the add to cart action here. So if we follow our code through, if you were to click on this button, you would be, calling this onClick method, and that would call this function here. And when that function runs, you're going to call dispatch. And when dispatch runs, inside the parentheses here, the value that you're passing there as the argument is the value that's returned from this function. So you're going to call add to cart function and pass the ID into it. So when you do that, we go up to add to cart here, and the ID is held in the index, and then we create an object with a type add to cart and a payload of index, right? So this object is returned, and that's the object that is placed here as the argument and sent to the dispatcher, okay? And when we send this thing through the dispatcher, what happens is we end up in the shopping cart reducer over here, and shopping cart reducer takes that action object and receives it as the second parameter. And then the current value for state is passed into state, okay? So, that's good to say it, but let's actually test it. So I'm gonna put a console log here, and let's log our action. Okay, so I'm gonna log the action here. And when I see the console here, you can see there's a couple actions with some weird types on them, right? And that's kind of like how Redux boots up. So it kind of sends a couple actions through there just to see what's going on, right? Let's refresh, and I'll clear the console here. And now I'm going to click an add to cart button. So this lot string should be ID number 2, right? So if I click on this, you can see that it says type is add to cart, payload is index number 2. So indeed, that was the object that we saw in our actions, right? That's this object right here. Type is add to cart, and the payload for us is index, and it's number 2, okay? So this got passed all the way through to our reducer, right? Let's take a look at state, right? What does state look like, okay? So I'm gonna, if action.type matches this add to cart right here, then we should be in this case, right? So we should end up inside this block right here when you click that add to cart button. So I'm gonna put console.log right here, and let's log state, okay? So I'm gonna refresh again. And you notice that these types right here don't match the add to cart type, so we don't log state, okay? So let's clear the console again, and this time I'll click on item number 2 again, and when I click add to cart, you can see that it says add to cart, index is number 2, and then it should be 1, 2, 3, and then another number 2. But we're actually logging the value before that item was added to the cart. Okay, so that it gets added afterwards, so we actually don't see it, right? But if I click again, like if I click on item number 1 this time, then it shows me, add to cart, item is number 1, and then it shows me the cart from last time, which is 1, 2, 3, 2. So if I was to click on item number 3 this time, the next cart should show up, and it should be 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, right? Okay, so indeed, I think our system is working, right? The reason we're not seeing the new items over here in the shopping cart is because of the way the shopping cart is working, right? So if I was to look at the shopping cart JS, like the component shopping cart, not the shopping cart reducer, right? Let's go find that. I'm going to go find shopping cart right here. And the shopping cart right here, it filters through data. And so data only has one copy of every item in it. But if that item's ID exists in cart, and it might exist there more than once, but if it just exists there at least once, then that item is included here one time, right? So, you know, all the items here are unique, but they might appear, the IDs might appear in here more than once, but that's okay, right? Because, you know, we only need one item. We just need to keep track of how, like what the quantity in the cart is for that item, right? Okay. So that's why the cart is working the way that it works. We can have as many items in here with the IDs are duplicated, but we're only going to get one of those items on this side, right? Because we're just saying like, hey, let's filter if, you know, at least one of those is included here because we're using cart.includes, right? So this needs to change, right? Let's go back to our reducer for a moment. So I'm going to go to shopping cart reducer, right? And we need to make some changes here too. So currently our cart keeps track of items in this way, right? So actually I have like item 1, 2, and 3 in here, right? Okay. And this isn't enough information to keep track of the item and the quantity, right? So why don't we do this? We're going to change this so that whenever you add an item to the cart, it's going to add an object. And the object will have an ID, like maybe ID number 1, and a quantity, maybe 1 of those items, okay? Let's say I added item number 1 to the cart, and, you know, it wasn't in the cart, so, you know, my cart looked like this. If I don't find that item here, I'm going to add it like this, okay? And when I do that, I'm creating an item with that ID, and I'm creating an item with a quantity of 1. Let's say we click the button a second time for item number 1. We'll search through the array, and if we find an item with that ID, instead of adding a new object, we'll just bump the quantity up by 1. So we'll change the quantity to 2, okay? Let's say I click on item number 2. So in that case, I search through the array. I don't find anybody with ID number 1 in here. So what I want to do is put a comma here and then add a new item for ID number 2 and give it a quantity of 1. Okay? So that's how this needs to work, right? And then our default state needs to change too. So let's tackle that right now. I'm going to remove these console logs. And what I want to do is, actually, let's remove this stuff too, okay? So I'll get rid of that because we're gonna make it look like this, right? So let's go in here and let's pseudocode our problem, right? So actually you can even stop the video and try it on your own if you want, okay? But I'll pseudocode the problem out, right? And maybe you can go through the pseudocode with me. Maybe write your own pseudocode and then compare it to what I write. Okay, so did you get a good example there? Let's try it, right? So I'm going to say this. I'm going to say like, hey, I'm going to first say, let's like loop, wait a minute. Yeah, we got to loop over state, okay? So if we loop over state, then I want to ask the question while we're looping, if, you know, item ID equals the index, which is on the payload, right? Then we know that one of those items already exists in the array, right? Because we matched this, right? The ID. So if that's the case, then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, you know, item quantity plus 1, okay? Right? And then the last step is going to be return new state. Okay, so we always have to return new state. We're going to maybe talk about that in another video just to make sure that's clear, because that's like a really important piece of Redux, okay? Okay, so what if I looped over the entire array and I got all the way to the end without returning, right? So in that case down here, we're gonna add new object, right? With ID and quantity only 1, right? And the ID will be equal to the index, right? Which is on the payload. So we'll do this as our last step. Okay, and actually I kind of already have that right here, so we're really going to kind of just modify this line. Okay, so now let's try and write this code. Okay, so let's start. Let's say, you know, for, I'm trying to think, could we map over this? I don't know. I think in this case we can't really. You could maybe force it, but I think it's better to do a for loop, and in a way it's kind of like a tiny bit more efficient because we're going to stop early if we find an item instead of going through the entire loop. Like map and filter are going to go through the entire array every time, right? But in our case, we are just looking for one item, and when we find it, we're done. So let's use a for loop in this case. We'll say let I equal 0, and we're going to loop while I is less than state dot length. Okay, and then we'll do I plus equals 1. Okay, so this is the first part here. So I looped over state. I'll just even put that here. Right, now we got to do this stuff, and that's all going to happen inside of our loop here. Okay, so let's do an if. So let's say if, and then this stuff's going to happen inside our if statement. Right, so if, let's do this here. Let's say if state bracket I dot ID equals action dot payload, and we could probably deconstruct this, but I think we can just do it like this here. So we'll say action dot payload dot index. So if that matches, then we found an item. We're going to bump its quantity. So let's say state bracket I dot quantity plus equals 1, and now we have to return new state. Now technically we probably should be copying this object, but what's going to happen is we really have to copy the array. So, but from what we're doing here, it's simple enough. We can just leave this object. We can just mutate it. But the outer array has to be copied. And like I said, we'll zoom in on that and really take a closer look at why that is in a future video. Okay. But now we just need to return some new state, right? And remember, when we return, it ends this function right here, so we don't continue and do anything else, right? We exit early. So let's do this. We're going to do return bracket, and we will copy state. Okay, so we just made a copy, and we return it. Okay. So now what happens? What if we don't? So now we're down to this last line here. We're done with our for loop. If we didn't return early, we looped over everybody in the array, and we didn't find anybody that matches that ID. We need to add this new thing to, we need to copy the state and then add a new item. So here I've got, let's actually take this out for a moment there. Here I've copied the array. So I just did brackets and then dot, dot, dot state. So I copied the array, did part of that, right? And then now I'm going to put a comma here, create a new object, give it an ID, right? And the value will be action.payload.index, and the quantity will be 1. Okay? So that should cover our pseudocode there. How did your pseudocode look, right? Did you solve that one on your own? Okay, cool. So let's take a look now. So I'm going to check this. It's not going to quite work right because the way that this works here is not really recognized. Remember, our shopping cart really wants numbers. It's not recognizing the objects yet. So we're going to have to edit the shopping cart. But let's see what it looks like if I console log. Actually, put the console log back in there just for fun, right? So let's do console log. let's console log action, and I'll just console log state too, just for fun, right? So there's state, and here you can see, let me clear it, right? If I add an item to the cart, you can see that I've got the payload should be index 2. Now remember, I'm logging the state here before it actually gets added, right? So this, on the second click, I'll see something, right? So I'll click on item number 3, and then you can see here I've got an item in my cart now that is ID number 2, quantity of 1. Okay, let's that's ID number 2. What if I click on number 2 again? You can see here with the second click, I added an item with ID of 3 and quantity number 1, and then you can see that I've got ID 2, quantity of 1. But if I click again, the next time through, you'll see that I've got ID 2 and it has a quantity of 2, right? I'll do it again. I'll click it again, and now you can see item number 3 is quantity of 2. So that's it. That's working correctly, right? So let's save this here on this video. So if you can see this here, we can see that our reducer is working correctly, right? And in the next video, we'll handle that in the shopping cart component. Okay, so thanks for watching, and I hope this is helping you understand Redux.